Well, good evening, and welcome to the Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Humanities Center. Thank you very much for being here tonight. My name is Matt Jordan, and I have the privilege of serving here as the Dean and Chair for Humanities at Cuyahoga Community College. This center, for those who aren't familiar with it, was created in 2015 when the Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Foundation gave the college the largest gift in its history, $10 million, to create a unique academic program that integrates the study of the humanities with an emphasis on leadership development and community engagement here in Northeast Ohio. We exist to serve two overlapping constituencies. Internally, we serve Tri-C students, particularly those who are enrolled in the Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Scholars Academy. The Mandel Scholars receive generous scholarship support, sufficient to cover the cost of full-time tuition, books, and fees for the entirety of the selective two-year program. They take a series of courses and participate in co-curricular activities designed to cultivate their leadership skills and give them a vision of what it could look like for them to serve and to lead here in Cleveland, now and in the future. They also have opportunities to interact with public figures and to engage in educational travel. Just this year, groups of Mandel scholars have met privately with former U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, traveled to Alabama on a civil rights tour, and sat down for a conversation with Starbucks CEO Emeritus and potential presidential candidate Howard Schultz. If it's not untoward of me to say so, this is really cool. If you or if anyone you know might be interested in participating in a program like this one, please be advised that we are currently accepting applications for fall 2019. More information is available online at tri-c.edu/Mandel Center. Looking outward, the Mandel Humanities Center also serves the people of Northeast Ohio. Cuyahoga Community College is the community's college, and the Mandel Humanities Center is a venue for educational events and thoughtful discussion of contentious and important topics. Tonight's program is part of the 2019 Cleveland Humanities Festival, sponsored by Case Western Reserve University. The festival's theme this year is nature, and we've invited a pair of internationally known scholars to present their answers to the question, is the natural world all there is? Each speaker will have 20 minutes to make their opening comments, and then they'll engage with each other and with me for about 25 minutes, leaving half an hour or so for questions from the audience before each speaker's closing remarks. The first speaker will be Dr. Louise Antony. Dr. Antony holds a bachelor's degree in philosophy from Syracuse University and a PhD in philosophy from Harvard University. She is currently a professor of philosophy at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She has also taught at Boston University, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and The Ohio State University. In addition to authoring numerous book chapters and articles in academic journals, Dr. Antony has edited several volumes, including an anthology titled Philosophers Without Gods, Meditations on Atheism and the Secular Life, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2007. She co-directs the mentoring program for early career women in philosophy and has served as president of both the Society for Philosophy and Psychology and the Eastern Division of the American Philosophical Association. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Louise Antony. Stay there. Our second speaker is Dr. Michael Ray. Dr. Ray earned his undergraduate degree in philosophy and economics at UCLA and did his graduate work at the University of Notre Dame in Indiana, completing his PhD in 1996. In 2001, he returned to Notre Dame as a member of the philosophy faculty, and in 2017 was appointed to the Reverend John A. O'Brien Chair of Philosophy, Notre Dame's oldest endowed chair. He is a prolific author whose published works include the books World Without Design, The Ontological Consequences of Naturalism, and The Hiddenness of God, both published by Oxford University Press. He has served as president of the Society of Christian Philosophers, and in 2017 was the Gifford Lecturer at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, joining a long list of preeminent intellectuals, including Hannah Arendt, Noam Chomsky, and Alfred North Whitehead. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Michael Ray. Dr. Antony and Dr. Ray, thank you both for being here, and thank all of you for being here as well. I now invite Dr. Louise Antony to the podium.
Well, thanks very much for this invitation. I really have been looking forward to this opportunity to talk with Mike and with all of you about this issue that I care about very deeply. It's a pleasure to be here. I think you should all be just enormously proud of the monument to the aspirations of ordinary people that this community college represents. So, here's the question we've been asked to address. Is the natural world all there is? I can give a quick answer to this question. Yes, thank you very much. No, just kidding. But the reason I can give that quick answer is that I more or less define nature in terms of what there is. But Mike's answer to this question is going to be no. Are we just disagreeing about what the word nature means? That would be pretty boring. So let's see if we can make the question into something more interesting. It would be handy to have a term for the claim that nature is all that exists. Let's call it naturalism. I accept naturalism and Mike rejects it. So what exactly do we disagree about? Now, you might have expected that this would be a discussion between two people who disagree about whether certain kinds of things exist, kinds of things we sometimes call supernatural. This would include beings like God, angels, and immaterial souls, and phenomena like prophecy and miracles. Now, I think Mike and I do disagree about the existence of such things, but it's important to understand why. I do not deny the existence of such things because they are supernatural. I can't say that because I don't really have any substantive definition of nature that would entail that certain kinds of things are not part of nature. Rather, I say that A, there's no good argument and no good evidence for the existence of such things, and B, that it's very difficult to see how such things could be squared with our knowledge of the other things in nature we know about. Now, this way of interpreting our disagreement makes disagreements about the existence of, for example, God or immaterial souls, no different from arguments about the existence of other kinds of things, like life on other planets, or whether there really was a King Arthur. From my point of view, that's exactly right. I say that if enough evidence, or if good enough arguments, could be offered in favor of their existence, then I would accept the existence of God, angels, and prophecy. In that case, however, on my way of reckoning things, these things would all become part of nature. They would not be supernatural at all. So because I'm prepared to consider claims about the existence of things like God on their merits, I don't want to characterize naturalism in terms of ontology. Ontology is what philosophers call the theory of what exists, what kinds of things exist. Instead, I want to characterize naturalism in terms of method. So the thesis that I'll call methodological naturalism is a thesis about the continuity of knowledge. It says that anything and everything that can be known by human beings, and that qualification is important. I don't hold, as some of my fellow naturalists do, that human beings will be able to understand everything. I think it's, even if we don't annihilate ourselves one way or another, I don't see any reason to think that our capacities are adequate to our understanding absolutely everything. But in any case, what I'll call methodological naturalism says that anything and everything that can be known at all is conformationally interconnected. And I'll explain what that means. Some of the connections between things that we believe or that we take ourselves to know are matters of logic. So it cannot be true both that all swans are white and that there are black swans in Australia. Most of the propositions, though, that constitute our theories, and I'm going to use the word theory in a very loose sense to mean the body of belief that a person has, maybe we can speak in terms of societies or groups, the bodies of belief we have about the world. Most of the propositions that constitute our theories of the world are connected through conformational or evidential relations. Some evidential relations are direct and obvious. Seeing my husband's car in the garage gives me some evidence that he is home. Seeing a piece of litmus paper turning blue gives me evidence that the liquid it is dipped in is, and I forgot to Google this, either an acid or a base, I can't remember which. Somebody will know that. But other kinds of conformational connections are quite indirect and unexpected. My favorite example of this is a connection that was made between a particular rabbit pot, that is a ceramic vessel that is decorated with the image of a rabbit, that was produced by the Mimbres people, probably between the 10th and 12th centuries, and the record of a supernova made by a Chinese astrologer in 1054. This is the nebula that, the supernova that the residue of that had formed the Crab Nebula. I really love this example because it's so unbelievably unlikely. So let me just tell you a little bit about how this works. For the Mimbres, the rabbit was a symbol of the moon, where we see a man in the moon, where some of us in Western cultures see, or they're Western too, in, say, American culture, British culture, see a man in the moon. The Mimbres saw a rabbit. So if you notice, there's a little thing at the base of the rabbit's foot, and I'll give you a better resolution image of the decoration. That's a little starburst, and you can't probably count them from where you are, but there are 28 spokes radiating out of that starburst. Now, the dating of this put it in the mid-11th century. It turns out that in 1054, there was a record in the records of the royal astrologer of the Emperor of China that there was a huge light in the sky located just below the moon that was visible for 28 days. So a team of anthropologists, historians, experts in Chinese, astrologists, astronomers, and archaeologists put together that this pot probably recorded the same supernova that the Chinese astrologer had reported. So that's a kind of quite unexpected kind of confirmation. The discovery of the pot confirmed something that was recorded in China in the Middle Ages. Now, evidential relations are not always positive. So I get a carton of milk and it has a sell-by date stamped on it, and the sell-by date gives me evidence that the milk is fresh, but I open the thing up and it smells awful, and that evidence outweighs the evidence provided by the sell-by date. Now, there are a variety of ways in which we can come to know things, but ultimately, we only have the following to go on: sense experience, reason, and our native endowments. Sense experiences are linked to the external world. Much of what we think of as evidence, whether for or against a given proposition, comes to us through our senses. But sense experience is not the only basis for believing or disbelieving a proposition. We also tend to try to square things with what we already believe, and that includes our beliefs about what things are likely to be true. The more confident we are about a given proposition, the more evidence it will take to change our minds about it. Similarly, the more unlikely we take a proposition to be, the more evidence it will take to get us to believe it. There are some propositions we are so sure of that it's hard to imagine evidence or arguments that could get us to reject them. But methodological naturalism says that because of the interconnections of support among our beliefs, any belief at all is at least subject to revision in light of evidence or argument. Now, the philosopher Willard Van Orman Quine used the metaphor of a web to illustrate this conformational interconnection. So imagine that your entire set of beliefs are somehow arrayed on this web. The strands that connect the web to its support, let's see, is this working? Okay, I don't think the pointer is working, but you can see the strands that are connected to something supporting the web. The strands that connect the web to its support represent propositions about sense experience. That's the connection with the world. The distance from the points of support represents the degree to which a belief is likely to be retained given sense experience. The center of the web contains the propositions that we're most certain of, that we feel most certain of, and the ones that it would take the greatest amount of disconfirming evidence to dislodge. Now notice that all the parts of the web provide some support for all of the other parts, and the points in the center are the most protected. It would require the loss of lots of other strands, lots of things we would have to give up before the center of the web was affected. Now, where's science in this whole picture? Some methodological naturalists want to say that science is the paradigm of all rational inquiry. Science, say these naturalists, represents our best and most reliable way of understanding the world. So if our ordinary beliefs are to pass muster, that is, if we're to be justified in holding those beliefs, they must be shown to be verifiable by accepted scientific methods. Now, I reject this view, and I really want to insist on this, because I think many objections to naturalism are objections to this form of naturalism. I have great respect for science, and I believe that there are many things about the natural world that we could never have known had we not developed the methods and practices that characterize science today. But we as human beings have a variety of ways of coming to know things. Science is just one way. There's plenty that human beings came to know, after all, before the emergence of what we now call science. So I do not want to disparage everyday ways of knowing, nor ordinary beliefs, which can be as well confirmed, often better confirmed, than fundamental principles of science. Quine put the proposition, "there have been dogs," into the same interior section of the web as the law of conservation of mass and energy. Indeed, science has to answer to everyday knowledge. If science wants to overthrow some common belief, like maybe the belief that the world is flat, it has to make a very strong case for that. Once we do have science, though, some interesting things happen. First, we can, through scientific investigation, explain why ordinary practices of inquiry work. Vision scientists, for example, can tell us in great detail how our visual system takes patterns of retinal stimulation and constructs a three-dimensional representation of the world. So some of you might be familiar with this illusion. It's a very famous illusion called the Mueller-Lyer illusion. The upper line, the blue line, probably, yes, looks longer than the red line, but they're exactly the same length. It has to do, the illusion's created by the outward flanges on the top one and the arrowheads on the bottom one. What vision scientists tell us is that we're interpreting this against an assumption that our visual system makes, which is that when you see something like the bottom, it's usually, take a look at the red part of the ticket booth, it usually represents two planes that are joined and protruding toward you. And that when you see something with flanges, it's two planes that are joined and going away from you. If the retinal image, if the retinal length of the two vertical lines are the same, our visual system, relying on innate assumptions about the way the world is, calculates that it must be that the one where the that's moved, that represents a planar join that's moving away from you, that must actually be longer. So that's an explanation of why we are subject to that illusion. That's an example of how science can tell us exactly when our visual system can be expected to get things right and when it will predictably get things wrong. So that's one thing. We can do science and explain why, to the extent that they do, ordinary practices work, like our sensory systems. But secondly, we can extend our ways of knowing. Science has given us microscopes, telescopes, X-rays, radar, ultrasound, magnetic resonance imaging, all different ways of getting information from the world that we weren't natively equipped with. Okay, now what about different ways of knowing? What about religious ways of knowing? Well, I do think in principle, as I said, that we can extend our ways of knowing. There could be ways of knowing that we have not, that not all of us experience. Not everyone can see in color. Some people are colorblind. Some people can't even see. So could there be some new kind of sensory modality, something like a sensory modality, something like perception, that gave us knowledge of religious truths. I don't rule it out in principle, but I rule it out in fact, because I don't think that there has not been offered any account of how such a sense modality might work. The other kind of evidence that you can have for the existence of sensory modality is a track record. That as you can see, well, I mean, imagine if a community of all deaf people were to be visited by someone who could hear, what would the hearing person do to persuade the deaf community that they had a sensory modality that the members of the deaf community couldn't experience? Well, the first thing to do would be to try to show that there are things that the hearing person could come to know that the deaf community could not, or at least not in the same way. So what I think would be required for me to take seriously the idea of a religious sense, it's sometimes referred to, Michael, correct me if I get this wrong, is a sensus divinitatis, a faculty through which people can experience divine truths or messages. What I think would be required is that there be at least a commitment to providing some kind of explanation, that the hypothesis that there is such a sensory modality would need, for me, to be incorporated into the web of belief. We would need to see how it can be conformationally integrated with the other things that we know to be true. Well, what does my rationalism, naturalism rule out if it doesn't rule out God, angels, ghosts, clairvoyance? It rules out discontinuities. It rules out there being, as I said, a kind of religious knowledge or religious perception that cannot be accounted for or verified or vindicated by natural sciences. Now, something that or by natural ways of knowing. Now, something that I get asked a lot is if our human ways of knowing are so great, does that mean that we're going to be able to explain everything? Well, I admitted at the outset, I made a point of saying I'm not committed to the view that we can. I recognize, in particular, a couple of really serious challenges to naturalism. That is, phenomena that clearly exist, that it's very hard to see could be integrated into a scientific understanding of the world. There are some non-human things like how did the universe begin? But there's a lot of human stuff, consciousness, intentionality. This is the property of things standing for other things. We can make anything we want to stand for anything else. We can do it deliberately. But to do it deliberately, we have to have thoughts that already are about something else. What makes our thoughts about something else? Now, that's a question that I've spent a lot of time considering as a philosopher. And I don't have an answer. Every answer that I've considered, I've found problems with. My response, however, is to say, these are challenges. It doesn't help to posit God or religious experience. It doesn't give us any more insight into these things that we can't understand without them. So that's my line. I don't see any good reason or arguments or evidence to believe in things like God or angels. And I don't see that positing or hypothesizing the existence of immaterial spirits or God gives us any more explanatory power than we would have had otherwise. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt, for the invitation to be here. Thank you, Louise, for agreeing to participate and for your talk just now, and thank you all for coming. My nephew was involved with a ministry called Jesus Burgers in Isla Vista, California. It's a ministry to college students in the heart of the main student ghetto near UC Santa Barbara. It's a fascinating thing. They distribute hamburgers free to the partying students in the ghetto on Friday nights, and then they do ministry. And there's a book that describes its founding called Jesus Burgers. And so I got the book because I thought this was super interesting. In the opening chapter, Jason Lomolino, who's the co-founder of the ministry, reports having devoted his life to ministry soon after an experience wherein God apparently inquired with an audible voice what he was living for. Other co-founders reported similar experiences. You might think this sort of thing is rare and unusual. You might suspect they're making it up, but it's not rare. Hang around much with contemporary American evangelicals and you'll hear a lot of this sort of talk. Most Christians think they talk to God. This is just prayer. I suspect most Jews and Muslims think the same, although I'm going to focus on Christianity because that's the tradition that I know. And a surprising number report that God talks back, sometimes with an audible voice. For some, God seems to speak from within. One friend of mine, her name was Stephanie, she would put direct questions to God, and she often talked as if she got direct answers. I asked her once how this went, because I just found it totally puzzling. Did she hear a voice? Did she see a vision? It's like this, she said. This one time I needed to find a friend of mine in town, but I had no idea where he was, so I asked God, where is he? After a minute, the thought came to me to go down to the coffee shop on 4th Street, so I did, and there he was. Now, I want to start tonight by asking what our discussion topic, the claim that nature or the natural world is all there is, implies about stories like these and about Christian belief in general. And in discussing this, my goal is going to be to say something about how experience of God and religious belief more generally can fit within a broadly scientific worldview. Tell someone like Jason Lomolino or Stephanie that nature is all there is, and I don't think you're commenting directly on the cause of their experiences, saying it's all in their head or whatever. Instead, I think you are in part saying something about where to look for the explanation. You're telling them, look for a science-like explanation invoking scientifically respectable entities. And the view that all explanations should be of that sort, I'm going to call sensible naturalism. So sensible naturalism is the view that every human experience has an adequate, purely natural explanation, one that is somehow continuous with good scientific explanations, invoking the kinds of objects that we find in good scientific theories. Note that I say adequate. I don't say complete or fully accurate or getting the whole causal story right, but it's adequate. I call it sensible naturalism because I do think it's a sensible, fairly modest view. And because Louise, well, that's why I call it sensible, and because Louise thinks that something like it, I take this to be in the neighborhood of her explanatory interconnectedness idea, something like it counts as a good statement of naturalism. It's not my own preferred statement of naturalism, but that's a matter for another time and another talk. It's also something that I think a person might mean by saying nature is all there is. It's not, as I'll explain later, in fact, what a lot of people mean, but I want to take it as a starting point and argue for the following thesis. Genuine experience of God and rational belief in God are consistent with sensible naturalism. So sensible naturalism is, contrary to what I think a lot of people believe, no threat to Christian belief. And again, I think it's no threat to other religious beliefs either, but I'm focusing just on Christianity for now. And I think there's a corollary to my thesis. If nature is all there is just says that sensible naturalism is true, then nature is all there is poses no threat to Christian belief. I do think there's a version of nature is all there is that Christians do have to disagree with, and I disagree with it, but as I'll explain at the end, I think that view is not well motivated. So here's my plan for the talk. I'll start by sketching a naturalism-friendly explanation of how experience of God works. I'll show how experience of God resembles our experience of other human minds, and I'll use the analogy with other human minds to explain how rational belief in God fits within a naturalistic framework. Stanford University anthropologist Tanya Luhrmann's book, When God Talks Back, is a study of experiences of God in American evangelical circles. Luhrmann spent 2 years going to Bible studies, church services, prayer groups, and so on, talking to people about their experiences of God, or as I sometimes call them, their divine encounters. For her dissertation, she was a Druid for 2 years, but for this book, she was an evangelical. The book is rich and engaging. I totally recommend it, but for purposes here, I want to highlight just 2 upshots. First, she says that divine encounters, even sensory divine encounters, ones that involve like sensory imagery, you hear a voice, you see a vision or something like that, divine encounters are not rare. Second, they result in part from the exercise of a learnable skill. She thinks that subjects learn to experience natural phenomena, often events within their own minds, as the voice, touch, implanted thought, or bare presence of God. And I want to highlight the experience as bit in this quotation. Luhrmann's view is that the experiences of God that she is studying involve what philosophers like to call experiencing as. The idea is that divine encounters involve ordinary stimuli being experienced as divine presence or divine communication. Ordinary stimuli like thunder, internal thoughts, hunches, and so on. Those are experienced as God's voice, God's inner prompting, or whatever. These experiences are shaped in part by expectation, desire, and other background cognition. And importantly, they are frequent in the general population and non-pathological. Like, as I'm saying this, you might be thinking, wow, she thinks they're like hallucinations or whatever. And in a certain way, in terms of what's going on in the brain, she thinks, yeah, they kind of are. But she emphasizes, and it's not just her, other scholars working on these topics say the same thing. This isn't pathological, it's totally common, totally frequent. Her view is divine encounters are generally experiences that would not necessarily be had by just any healthy observer attending to the same internal or external stimuli. And in some cases, the stimulus is an internal phenomenon that would produce in other subjects an experience as of having a hunch, intuition, spontaneous idea, dream, or whatever. In other cases, it's an external phenomenon that would likely produce an experience in other subjects, an experience as of a perfectly natural object or event, like thunder, like the thunder that reportedly accompanied Moses' reception of the Ten Commandments. And again, this is a perfectly ordinary phenomenon. And in fact, on this view, divine encounters are similar to perfectly ordinary cases where observers with different background beliefs, desires, fears, or other cognitive states report different experiences in the presence of the same natural stimuli. So some examples. I don't know how many of you have seen an ultrasound. Either you've had an ultrasound or you've been with someone who's having an ultrasound. I have 5 kids, so I've seen several of these. And every time I see something like this on the screen, and I can kind of make out a head and a foot, right? But the ultrasound technician looks at this and says, oh yeah, okay, everything's looking good, no abnormalities. Oh, and look, it's a boy or it's a girl. And I'm thinking, I see a head and just some blotches, right? But what's going on is the training of the ultrasound technician functions as a kind of lens through which he or she will see this thing, and the technician will just see the well-formed limbs, right? The indication that it's a boy or a girl, and so on. I just see blotches because I don't have the right kind of background cognition. Or take this sort of case. When I was a kid, I'd be going to bed and I'd hear these sounds that were cracking noises. They were clearly the footsteps of an intruder of some sort. Probably a space alien, but somebody clearly coming to get me. My dad, who knew I knew this too, but it didn't really process. My dad, who knew that the house had been built on a swamp, only heard the house settling, right? Now, in this case, my dad was right. It was the house settling. And I think what we want to say here is my dad hears the house settling. I mistake certain stimuli for the footsteps of an intruder. If there'd been an intruder, we would say, I heard the intruder, and my dad didn't. My dad thought it was the house settling, right? And, I seem to hear an intruder because I'm interpreting through the lens of my fears and things like that. My dad seems to hear the house settling because he's interpreting through his knowledge of where the house is built and so on. In the ultrasound and intruder cases, background cognition, fear, belief, and so on impacts the experience and helps to determine its overall character. Subjects who differ in their background cognition have different experiences. And I want to say divine encounters work similarly. Lerman focuses on sensory experiences. She's really interested in people's visions and the voices they hear and things like that. But there are plenty of other kinds of experiences of God. If you grew up in the way I did, right? You sit around the campfire at the youth camp and you feel the presence of God in that place. Or you go to church and the liturgist says, in the name of Jesus, I tell you your sins are forgiven, and you feel the forgiveness of God. My friend Stephanie heard the voice of God in her head, not audibly, right? But it was, as far as she was concerned, God telling her to go to the coffee shop on 4th Street. You go out into nature and you experience the majesty of God, maybe. I get experiences like this when I go to the beach, or backpacking in the Grand Canyon. So in light of all this, let me highlight 3 claims in my naturalism-friendly account of divine encounters. So first, divine encounters are always cognitively impacted experiences whose stimuli are purely natural phenomena. Second, the ability to have such experiences is a kind of skill, partly the product of socialization, training, and various other learned ways of experiencing and engaging with the world. And I'll add, the Christian tradition totally affirms this, right? There are all kinds of manuals throughout the centuries on how to experience God, basically. And then third, these kinds of experiences can be genuine divine encounters. So this isn't a debunking view, right? These kinds of experiences can be genuine divine encounters if the natural events stimulating them are at least partly explained by God's intention that the subjects experience them in the ways that they did. On this picture, if, as I think, there is a God who is intending that many of these experiences be experienced the way that they are, divine presence is, in a certain way, ubiquitous. Learning to experience God is partly a matter of just learning to view the world as an arena of ongoing divine activity, filtering our experience through a theistic lens, as it were. I don't know how all this strikes you. I think it initially strikes a lot of people, despite what I've said, as a kind of debunking view. And I want to emphasize that it's not. And I think the way to do it is to point to an analogy with how we experience the presence of other human minds, right? And if you think about it, we detect other people's bodies by way of sense perception, but their mentality we don't have access to that way. We don't have access to their mental states as physical objects. We can't peer in and see them. We don't have introspective access to other people's mental states. How do we get there? How do we know that there are other minds in these other bodies? I think a natural conclusion to draw is that the only way we manage to experience the presence of other human minds is in the way I've been saying we have divine encounters, by way of cognitively impacted experiences whose stimuli are natural physical phenomena. And I think a natural further conclusion from this is that belief in other human minds is not something we posit to explain data, but rather just a kind of lens we use for interpreting the world, and a hypothesis in light of which our world makes sense. We didn't sort of grow up watching other people talk and think, okay, I need to find some explanation for this datum. We just naturally think of other people as having minds. We look at the world through a kind of other mind lens. And the belief in other minds is, I think, that's a sensible way to view the world, and the belief in other minds that comes along with it is both natural and sensible too. You might put it this way: we have a kind of cognitive bias toward belief in other minds, and our experience of the world makes a good deal of sense in light of the other minds hypothesis. We could give it up under pressure, but we start with the bias, and most of us never really find a good reason to give it up. I think it's important to note that there's no in-principle conflict with naturalism, at least not with sensible naturalism, in maintaining our cognitive bias toward belief in other minds. And if you hold the things that I've just been saying about experience of other minds in your head and think now about belief in God, I think it starts to look plausible that rational belief in God is like rational belief in other minds. It functions more like a lens through which we interpret the world than like a hypothesis that we put forward to explain data. I don't think most theists come to their theism in a kind of like, I have some data I need to explain, so let me posit God sort of way. They, for whatever reason, start off by interpreting their world through something like a theistic lens, or if they don't start that way, they come to it at some point in their life, and their world makes sense that way, and they stick with it. So now we come back to my thesis. Experience of God and belief in God are consistent with sensible naturalism. And this, I want to say, for roughly the same reasons that belief in and experience of other minds is consistent with sensible naturalism. And the corollary, if nature is all there is, just says that sensible naturalism is true, then nature is all there is poses no threat to Christian belief, that just follows from the thesis that I've been defending. So is nature all there is? Well, if the question just asks whether sensible naturalism is true, then I say maybe. But I think normally when people say, yes, nature is all there is, they're not endorsing just sensible naturalism. They're endorsing that plus the claim that God can't fit within a scientific worldview, where a scientific worldview is something like belief in the objects posited by current scientific theories. But that claim that God can't fit into that kind of worldview, well, a worldview that respects science or whatever, that seems to me to be unmotivated, right? Why would you assume that all there is what's posited by current scientific theories, or that all there is are things pretty much like what's posited by current scientific theories? But I do think that's often what people mean by nature is all there is. Under that interpretation, I reject the yes answer. And I think that neither science nor philosophy nor sensible naturalism forces us to say yes to that question. And it's that latter claim that I've been most interested in defending tonight. Thank you. This slide has some sources.
Okay, well, thank you both for getting things started here. As you know, I have a couple of questions that I'm hoping to ask before things are over, but I thought it would be more fitting for you two to get this conversation going. Dr. Anthony, we just heard from Dr. Ray. Perhaps you'd do us the honor of letting us know. What do you think? What do you do with his claims?
Tell you my views about something? All right. If
I've heard that you're willing to.
That was really interesting, Mike. I just want to register, first of all, that I'm not committed to the view that all that exists is what is currently, in the canon of contemporary science. I'm very interested in our knowledge of other minds. When I said that all we have to go on is evidence, reason, and native endowments, one of the things I had in mind was what many psychologists call the theory of mind, which is posited to be an innate cognitive structure that allows us to do things like interpret facial expressions, gives us folk beliefs like if people are looking at something that's indicative of what they might want, things like that. And as I'm sure you know, some clinical psychologists believe that autism might be the result of an absence of the development of that kind of module, which explains why autistic individuals sometimes have trouble understanding facial expressions or connecting what people are looking at or talking about with what they want and so forth. But I think that there are lots of differences between the reasons we have for thinking that we've got innate help believing in other minds, innate dispositions to believe that certain beings have minds, and the disposition to believe that God is the author of some experience. I think that there's a lot of progress in understanding how such a cognitive structure could come into being. It's virtually universal, except for cases of certain kinds of clinical deficits or clinical differences, like autism. There's nothing like that kind of universality about experience of God. I don't have data, but I would be surprised if most people have had such an experience, that they're inclined to describe that way. Well, let's see. There are a whole bunch of things I want to say about that, but I don't want to take up all the oxygen.
We'll say at least one of them.
So here's one of the things about take the case of Dr. Luhrmann, Tanya.
Yeah, Tanya Luhrmann.
Luhrmann, saying that she heard God. Now, it's not just that that has to be consistent with the best science, or maybe, I mean, it could inform the best science. It could improve science by science taking account of this, but it also has to conform to our ordinary way of using words. So here, when she hears the voice of God, that has to be hearing. And what she hears needs to be a sound. I mean, if it's just something that's like hearing and it's something that's like a sound, then we don't really have the kind of perceptual access to something that we think we do. And this isn't a matter of, as I said, it's not a matter of scientific dogmatism. It's a matter of understanding what the hypothesis is. The other thing that I think is really interesting, and I'll just mention it and not say everything that I might say about this. I really like the suggestion. I thought it was really interesting to suggest that the ability to hear God might be the result of some kind of learning or training. There is perceptual learning. We know that sonogram technician being able to interpret that is an excellent example of that. But again, that's a pretty well understood process. I mean, vision scientists actually know something about what happens to neurological structures when you repeatedly have certain experiences. We also know that there can be training that affect your focus and your attention, and these can actually, there's a sense in which it's not that you and the sonographic technician are seeing different things. You're actually seeing, well, sorry, there is a sense in which you're literally seeing different things. The sonographic technician is looking at things, focusing on things that don't strike you as important. And all of that stuff can be understood quite naturalistically. Moreover, there's a track record. When the sonographic technician says this is the head of the baby, well, there are subsequent experiences that confirm that. I don't know what confirms, I don't know what it would be for me to go about getting confirmation that Tanya Luhrmann actually heard the voice of God. So those are just some differences. I'll leave it at that.
It's helpful. Dr. Ray, you want to respond to that, or the broader Antonian perspective?
Can I have about 45 minutes for that? There is a lot there. So I'll pick out the things that I can. First, I guess, in fairness to Tanya Lerman, I should say, I didn't mean to say that she heard the voice of God. She was basically, she's an anthropologist who just kind of immersed herself in these communities and studied the experiences that people were reporting. So first, one of the things you said was, you know, we have these kind of well-understood psychological devices, right? Not positing, but for looking at the world as minded.
Yeah.
Less clear that we have the same sort of thing for religious experience. I would agree that I'd certainly agree that religious experience isn't as universal as belief in other minds, but the cognitive scientists of religion, folks like Justin Barrett, they are saying that, you know, there is a pretty universal disposition to posit agential explanations in terms of agents for a whole wide variety of phenomena.
Sure.
And it's partly because of this that Barrett just draws pretty straight lines to the analogy with belief in other minds.
Dr. Ray, if I can interject, for the sake of those who might not be familiar with that way of talking, when you say an agent or agential explanations, what do you mean by an agent there?
Yeah, like somebody doing stuff as opposed to like things just falling and bumping into one another.
As a result of intention.
Yeah, things happening by design rather than just mechanically or something like that. And the idea is that we have a natural, you know, you're in the forest and you hear a rustling sound, you have a natural disposition to think there's something out there deliberately moving, probably coming to eat you, right?
You're a little paranoid, Mike.
This isn't even kind of a theme.
I am an anxious backpacker. But yeah, so there is, that's just on the point of universality. On the well-understood bit, there's been a lot of research lately on religious experiences and on something along the lines of the sort of picture that I'm sketching, and especially a lot of research on, I guess, the ways in which people can, as you might put it, acquire the ability to have these sorts of experiences. And it turns out that there is, I guess I wouldn't say it's super well understood, but like there are sort of psychological tests that you can take that predict your propensity to have these sorts of experiences and stuff. But I guess the main thing that I'm interested in for our conversation with this analogy, yeah, there was the bit in your talk where you said, you know, I'm not going to quote it right, but it's something like kind of the way science works is if you're going to believe in stuff, you want to have arguments and reasons for believing in those things. And what I find interesting about the other minds analogy is that that's what we don't have in the case of other minds. If you become an other mind skeptic, it'd be really hard to argue you back into belief in other minds. Like we just don't have that kind of evidence. There are arguments for the existence of God, and if folks have been really persuaded by those, I don't want to, you know, undermine that. But I don't feel like a whole lot of people come to belief in God on the basis of argument. I do think it's much more, we come to that sort of belief in sort of the way in which we might come to belief in, this is not how we in fact do, but if somehow we started out not believing in other minds, but then just came to it, what that would be, I think, would be just coming to look at the world through an other mind sort of lens and seeing how it looks to us instead of looking at it through the skeptical lens. And I think that is a lot more how theistic belief gets started and then gets maintained.
So let me see if I'm following the dialectic here correctly. It sounds like Dr. Antony is essentially saying, well, look, we need to figure out how to fit the different pieces of our worldview together, right? And how to fit the data that we've got and how to make sense out of things. And we do that by explaining our experiences in accordance with certain kinds of causes and making predictions about what's likely to happen and so on. And Dr. Antony, your view, if I'm hearing you correctly, is, and look, I just don't see how the God stuff or the angels and demons or miracles, like that doesn't fit into the coherent picture of the world that makes sense. And Dr. Ray, if I'm hearing you correctly, you're not saying, like some people, and if folks have studied philosophy of religion, you may have heard this kind of argument. You may have heard people say, well, some people have religious experiences, and now in order to explain those experiences, we have to believe in a God. That's not your view, right? Instead, what you're saying is, I kind of agree with Dr. Antony, except that I want to suggest that if we look at all of this stuff through a certain kind of lens, if we, I don't know, are we saying if we take it as a starting point that maybe there really is a God, then we'll see things differently? Or can you elaborate on that part of the view?
Yeah, I think most of our experiences, I think, we take my experience of a table, right? I seem to see a table. I just automatically take that at face value. Looks like there's a table there. I believe that there's a table. I automatically take it at face value. I don't think, okay, I'm having some sense impressions, now I need something to explain those. I'm going to posit a table. That's just not how that works, right? I think for a whole lot of us, for a whole lot of people who have something like an experience of God, it works much the same way, right? You go to church, you feel like the presence of God is there, and you think you're already open to belief in God, or you already have belief in God, and you think, I feel the presence of God. You take it at face value, and it's not like you're thinking, I have this experience, now I need to posit some explanation. Like, that's not how it works. And I think this ordinary approach to taking our experiences at face value, I think that's rational. And I also think that the move from being someone who can't find God anywhere in the world to being someone who starts to see events as providentially guided, who starts to experience the presence of God in church, or the move from being the one sort of person to the other is more like acquiring a lens through which you look at the world than acquiring some argument that has now given you a kind of inference to the best explanation, reason for believing in some new entity.
Can I make it?
Of course.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right to say that we don't come to the conclusion that there's a table there because it's the best explanation of our experience. But a couple of things about that. One is, we don't do it, but that is sort of what our visual system does. And that's one of the things that, I mean, that's the sort of thing, so this is, I mean, forget that it's a table. That requires some theory. You have to think that it was made for a certain purpose. But that it's a three-dimensional object of certain dimensions and color, right? You know, there's just a lot of serious science about, well, look, what there are light intensities being, striking my retina. How does the thought that there's a table there emerge out of that? And there's a story to tell there. And that's one of the ways in which I think, that's sort of what I had in mind when I said that science has to answer to common experience, right? It's not if vision scientists said to us, you know what, actually we're not justified in thinking that there are any three-dimensional objects arrayed in space. You know, we just say, you need to get your degree revoked. I mean, that's just not, that's what science is supposed to do, is explain the stuff that's obvious. I mean, every once in a while something that we thought was obvious would turn out not to be true, but, you know, by and large, science has to vindicate the stuff that we believe and rely on a daily basis. And I think something similar is true about our propensity to treat things as agents. And there's a lot of really interesting developmental psychology about this. There are at least a couple of sets of sufficient conditions for getting even a very small infant, 5-month-old infant, to respond to something as if it's an agent. Babies apparently have 2 categories of things, physical objects and agents. And physical objects have to obey physical laws, and agents can do anything they want. I mean, a lot is known about what triggers a thought of agency, and for most people it takes a little more than a rustling sound in the forest. But you can get a fuzzy slipper, a motorized fuzzy slipper that's moving around on a stage, a baby to treat that as an agent, and the key there is if its movements are coordinated with a human voice. So, you know, the more we probe about these things, the more we say, wow, we do sort of immediately come, I mean, we just see people as being agents, as having minds. How does that work? Why does that happen? You can ask that question, you can get a serious answer. Right? Not everything is understood about it, but I mean, I think that's something that a naturalist has to commit to and say, yeah, there's got to be some explanation of that. And the other difference is, it's pragmatically impossible to be a solipsist, to think that you're the only mind. Now, I don't think that it follows from something's being pragmatically necessary that it's true or you're justified. But that pragmatic necessity is something that needs to be explained as well. Why do we operate in this way? And here I think philosophy has a role to play in telling us what kind of thing a mind actually is, what it is for being to be an agent. And one of the conditions of an adequate account of that is that it explain why the markers of agency that we take to be there actually are markers of agency. So I mean, I disagree with my husband, who's a philosopher too, and works in philosophy of mind. I'm a functionalist. I believe that mentality is a matter of how our brains are organized. And that organization manifests itself in the way we behave and so forth. So I think, that, again, I want to say there's a whole picture that fits together. And, I mean, this is the right argument. This is the argument that I would want to have is, can experience of God fit into that picture as well and as smoothly?
So it's sort of a helpful laying out of the playing field here. And this kind of discussion being what it is, right? I mean, we could easily spend not just the whole evening, but we could spend the whole remainder of the spring 2019 semester, right, unpacking these things and going back and forth. And there'd be value in that. But if I may be so bold, I'd like to push us in a couple of other directions and get some other ideas out in front of us. And in particular, as I was thinking about tonight's conversation, I thought through, well, what are the things that strike me, and my own academic background is in philosophy, so I've thought about some of these things a little bit. What are the things that strike me about naturalism that seem really problematic? And what are the things, not just about supernaturalism, but knowing, Dr. Ray, that you're a Christian theist, what are the things that would worry me from the point of view of Christian theism, right? So I thought of, what should keep these people awake at night? And I want to throw one challenge of that kind at each of you before we turn to questions from the audience. And Dr. Antony, if I may, I'll start with you. Here's what I think should trouble you. Here's what I think should be your person sneaking up
creepy,
at night.
I agree.
Spiders are awful.
Yeah.
That's a problem for the theist, right? The worry is this. I wrote it out technically in my notes, but I'll try to paraphrase. I'm going to assume, and you're welcome to challenge this assumption, but I'm going to assume that if we're committed to the view that nature is all there is, then a human being is essentially and ultimately a physical object. And in particular, I'm going to assume that our brains are physical, and that whatever mental life we have depends, in some strong sense, on the workings of our brains. But as a philosopher, I think you should be very alarmed by this, because if brains are physical objects, then whatever happens in our brains, whatever's going on inside my skull and your skull and your skull and all your skulls, or whatever's going on inside our heads right now, is determined by the laws of physics and chemistry. So as you've sat here and made some very cogent points, I think that there's some sense in which you want to say, Michael Ray, you should agree with me. But Dr. Anthony, in your view, poor Mike's just a machine, right? And if the inputs that is ultimately the sounds that you've been making, the vibrations in the air that you've been causing for the last hour or so, right? If those are going in through his ears and causing certain kind of stimuli in his brain, well, whatever response he makes to those stimuli is determined, right? So the poor guy's stuck, right? Whether he agrees with you or not.
Okay, so
right?
let's suppose I'm committed to that. I want to say two things. So let me just label the one thing, and then I want to press on the second thing. One thing I want to say is, we're all made of atoms, but look how different we are. I mean, it's all on how you put things together. And there are ways of putting material things together in such a way that the causal processes those things undergo mirror rational processes. That's what computers do. And Alan Turing, who laid the mathematical foundation for the modern computer, answered a question that Descartes had. Descartes was a dualist. He believed that there were material things and then there were also mental things. And one of his arguments, this is in his main argument for dualism is in his Meditations, but he also wrote a work called Discourse on Method. And there he makes a sort of empirical argument for dualism and says he doesn't see how a material object could have the capability to make an infinite number of rational responses to things. Well, Turing told us how we can do that. He told us how we can mechanize at least a certain part of reason. So that's the one thing. I think that there are ways that material can be put together so that even though the processes are deterministic, they are mirroring rational processes, and that's what we care about when we think about people doing things for reasons. The other thing I want to say is, all right, we've at least got bodies. Now, add an immaterial soul to that. How does that help with the determination problem? Philosophers of my ilk will say something like mental states supervene on physical states, which means you can't have a difference in the mental states without there being some physical difference. But if you think that our bodies are determined, what are the thoughts and the will, and what's all that stuff doing? Is it sort of floating free of the brain states that we're passing through? Is it just kind of hovering above? I mean, it doesn't help with that. I agree, I do lose sleep over that. It's a hard problem. But I don't see that positing anything immaterial is going to help.
Which fits really nicely with your opening comments tonight. Well, thank you. And then let me shift gears again and give a totally different question to Dr. Ray. So you've mentioned that you come at these questions from a distinctively, not just theistic, but Christian theist point of view. And as a Christian theist, you're going to agree with Jewish and Muslim and other religious believers that there's a loving God out there, right? But it seems like if that's true, right, if there is in fact a loving God who is behind it all and who has all of our destinies in God's own hands, so to speak, right? Well, that's like super important, right? I mean, that's like the most fantastically important thing that anybody could possibly know. It bears on all kinds of aspects of our lives, certainly bears, according to those traditional religions, on what it means to flourish, what it means to live well as a human being. And God must know that, right? And so you'd think that God it would be very easy for a God to make all of us absolutely certain that theism is true, right? And yet, here we are, right? Having a conversation like this one, and with a lot of people apparently interested in wondering this. People don't seem to find it obvious. And I wonder, isn't that fact itself, isn't the fact that God is hidden, to use the word from the title of your book, doesn't that fact itself give us reason to embrace atheism rather than theism? Oh, and before you start, let me say, we do want to give a chance for the audience to ask questions. We have microphones down to either end. So while Dr. Ray is answering this question, if people want to start moving toward those microphones, we can pick up those questions in a couple of minutes. So.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So the hiddenness of God, I think, is deeply puzzling and frankly, painful. It was sort of ironic. I spent about 2015 to 2018, I get maybe the end of 2017, writing a book on the hiddenness of God. And all during that time, there was various just bits of turmoil going on in different quarters of my life, stuff going on at my church and things like that. And I was thinking, isn't this just cliche? Here I am writing on the hiddenness of God and experiencing the hiddenness of God. And so I don't, nothing I'm about to say is to minimize just the actual pain and difficulty and puzzlement of it. But having said that, as an argument against the existence of God, the problem of divine hiddenness, I think, trades on expectations on divine love that were not warranted in making, right? So the way you put it, you say, look, this is super important, right? But the fact that God exists is super important. So of course God would want to make that known. Why? Well, the reasoning lurking in there is God loves us. Of course, God's going to desire our best. And of course, God's going to do whatever it takes to bring about what's best for us. I think as long as we're using the words what's best for us to mean our good in the short term, right? Not like our sort of ultimate good, but our good in the short term. No, we're not warranted in having that expectation because we don't know what other goods God's pursuing. And on the assumption that God is perfectly good, perfectly loving, omniscient, and also just personal, deeply personal, the sort of being with, God has God's own interests and projects, right? We don't know exactly where our short-term good is going to come out in the balance. I think that's not something you ever want to hear in a relationship. You get into conflict with your spouse or your parent, and your parent says, look, you're good and my interests conflict on this occasion. It's clearly going to be my interests that are going to win out this time. Like we want to complain about this. But the fact is, loving relationships make these kinds of trade-offs all the time. And you say, well, yeah, but in the case of divine hiddenness, like some people are in agony, right? Like this isn't just, who's going to have to do the dishes tonight or something. True. And that's why I say I don't want to minimize the pain of divine hiddenness. But at the same time, I want to maximize what I think we're told in Scripture, which is that at the end of all things, the evils that we suffer, the sufferings we undergo, that gets defeated in the context of our life. So it's not like we just get...
Meaning what, exactly?
Yeah, it's not like we just get a big payback at the end of it. It's not like God somehow compensates us for it. Rather, God weaves that into a whole story so that somehow that, even though that was a bad thing, that whole story is a good and beautiful story, one that you yourself would look at and say, that's good. That one part of it was bad, but that whole thing is good in a kind of deep and puzzling way. I say deep and puzzling because I think that's how it's going to have to be with sufferings. But I mean, look at the story of the death and resurrection of Jesus. There's deep horror woven into that story. But people for generations have viewed it as the greatest story ever told. Like it's a story of great beauty. Jesus will look back, according to the Christian view, Jesus will look back on that life and say that was a good and beautiful life, even though it included actual horrors, right? You say, well, yeah, he got to save the world. What do I get? Well, I don't know what you get, but that's an instance of defeat, and I think the Scriptures are committed to God will bring about defeat of all of our sufferings. When you put that in the equation, and then you also note that yeah, our short-term good does get sacrificed for other worthy projects that we know nothing about. Then I think you have a story about divine love that, I don't want to say it makes sense, because we don't look and go, oh, okay, it's cool that I'm suffering. But you have a story about divine love that hiddenness can fit into in a way that doesn't clearly undermine the divine love.
Thank you. All right, so do we have any questions? It looks like we have one down here, for actually a couple over here, and I think we had somebody over here. So if you want to go ahead and move to the microphone over here. And we'll plan to just alternate back and forth between the two, and we'll see how that works for us.
My name is Noel Contreras, president of the Student Government Western Campus, and I'm a triple major student. And I have a question about how would you interpret the existence of God? So basically, in my bioethics class, when I was learning about the theory, moral theory, there was a moral theory.
I'm sorry?
Moral theory.
Moral theory?
Moral theory.
So I was learning that the divine command ethic theory and the natural law theory was explained. How do we know what is correct or not based on the God conception of that? And the author of that says that the human being is just able to interpret it or understand the things associated with things that he already knows. That's why we have sciences and we have theories and hypotheses, because we are able to associate it with something that is provable for us, if you know what I mean. Like, if I see a horse, I know that it's a horse because in my planet, in my earth, in my country, there is a horse. And since you are a kid, you have experience with horses, and you interpreted that this is a horse. So how could we interpret what is God if we don't have experience, previous experience of how he is or how we are? He's like beyond us. So how could you like theorize like, okay, it's like if your senses doesn't interpret it, if you can't see it or listen it or feel it, or how could you determine the system of God?
How could we have imagined it if we haven't experienced it?
Is that a fair way to put it? Mm-hmm. So the question was articulated, thanks Dr. Lenahan. The question is, if we haven't experienced something, then how could we possibly interpret it in this particular theistic sort of way? Is that a fair way to put it? Okay.
I don't have any particular expertise in the history of religion, so I don't know. I mean, I think there are some people that have some ideas supported by some evidence about how religious ideas came into various human cultures. Of course, there have been a lot of different religious ideas in different cultures. There's no mystery, I think, about how we could come up with a description like the description of the Christian God. We imagine a being that that can do anything, that knows everything, that is perfectly good. Those are all descriptions that we can compose out of concepts that we use every day. Of course, there are lots of things that don't exist that we imagine the existence of. We do it for fun. We do it sometimes more seriously. So I don't actually see what's problematic about coming up with the idea of God. I think I might not be getting at what you're trying to ask.
What I'm trying to explain is, if the human being, the race, is not able to feel something, how could you say that it doesn't exist? If you say that God doesn't exist because you can't see it or listen it.
Do you think leprechauns exist?
What?
Do you think leprechauns exist?
I don't know what is leprechauns.
Oh, okay. Santa Claus? Do you think Santa Claus exists?
No.
Why? Have you experienced Santa Claus?
No.
Okay, so why do you think he doesn't exist?
It's not even part of my culture. There's about Santa Claus here when I got here.
Well, but I mean, now that you've heard about him, why do you think he doesn't exist?
because it's the first time I see it. I mean, I heard about it when I got here. So
I think he doesn't exist partly because I think it's physically impossible for there to be a person that has his characteristics. So I think one can be justified in thinking that things don't exist.
can I
I think
just,
we should probably press on to the next question, just to make sure we get
I don't know
enough
if
things
Mike
out.
wants to say.
And if we have time, Mike, did you want to add anything to that?
No?
Well, let's move over here then.
Hello, thank you for the talk, very informative. So given the idea that, or the backdrop that we've evolved, and we started from single-cellular organisms and moved on to multicellular all the way through to the chimpanzee and then finally to us, and then at each stage there's been adaptive traits that have persisted because of evolution. I guess I've heard it say that we've evolved to have a God-shaped void in our brains where we've evolved to seek meaning and structure and higher order and so on and so forth. So I guess my question is, even though there isn't a God, and there isn't, can we be fully human if we don't seek God, if we don't use that God-shaped part of our brain that requires us to seek higher order and meaning and so on and so forth? So even if there isn't a God, can we be human if we don't seek?
Great question. It sounds like one for both of you.
Well, so far so good, I think. I guess I don't share the idea that there's some natural necessity for human beings to believe in God. And I will say, I mean, there are an awful lot of religious systems that I've at least heard about that are polytheistic. And the divinities in some of these systems have very different properties from the divinities from the Christian God. Christians and Jews disagree about the divinity of Jesus. So it's not perfectly clear to me that there is one God conception that is shared among all the people who would call themselves religious, who believe in some kind of divinity. I wonder, when you say evolve, do you take that to mean, I mean, anything that is true of us is something that's evolved. You mean selected for, it's an adaptation. Yeah, so I don't believe that all evolution involves natural selection. I think there's some things that are just accidents. Some things, I mean, why we have 5 fingers and 5 toes on each hand or foot, that's just a number, the number we inherited from the progenitor of all of the things with our body plan. And there might be cognitive habits that just emerged by accident. Maybe we've, I mean, our voices, right? They're very handy for communicating, but we can also, some people can sing with them. Good, it might be that the tendency to think that there has to be some larger purpose to the whole universe, maybe that came along with the capacity for mathematics. I don't know. But I think there's a lot of variety in the way human beings negotiate life, and I think that a life without God is at least livable.
Do you want to add anything to that, Mike?
Yeah, I guess I think the view that your very humanity is at stake with seeking God or not, I think that's a view that's at home in a theistic worldview, right? So like, I think God exists. I think we were made for a relationship with God. So I do think there's some sense in which you're not fulfilling your design if you're not at least seeking that. But I think if I had mostly my same views except I wasn't a theist, my thought would be like this. Of course, I'm not going to say my humanity is at stake in whether I seek God, but I think I still would think one really ought to not foreclose that question hastily, if at all. I mean, if there is such a being, it is hugely important. And our evidence is so inconclusive, I think, that I personally don't really understand why people just completely foreclose that, right? The case against God isn't like the case against Santa Claus. It's not to say there's no case, right? But it's not like the case against Santa Claus. I would say there's a kind of pragmatic, like, yeah, you ought to be seeking, but it's not so momentous as putting your very humanity at stake.
And if I can throw in a follow-up to this question, and then that speaks to this sort of thing, and I think is another kind of worry. I think Dr. Anthony, you might have mentioned something about morality in an email, and the original question that was asked referred to divine command theory, which is a theory of ethics that says all morality depends on God's commands. And it does seem like there's some interesting things in this ballpark when we talk about the meaning of life, when we talk about what's valuable and so on. There's certainly a lot of people who have thought that those kinds of questions pose a problem for the naturalist, right? They'll say, look, if we're naturalists, life is meaningless, or there are no objective moral truths. And I wonder, again, that's a huge topic, but Dr. Anthony, if you could briefly comment on that, and then also Dr. Ray, do you see those kinds of questions as some kind of evidence for a supernaturalistic worldview, or are those inconclusive at best?
I think that meaning is imminent in the living of a human life if you have the good fortune to have the material circumstances that allow you to exercise your intellect, exercise your physical talents, find beauty. These things are not available to all people in the world, as we know. I think that meaning is inherent in the loving relationships that we have with other people, in the projects that we pursue together, in our sense of justice, in the motivation to fix injustices. Those are things that come up in human life, and if that's not enough to give life meaning, and I'm going to speak in a way that may sound disrespectful to religious people, but if that's not enough to give my meaning, why does the existence of some external being who has something in mind for me to do, why does that give my life meaning? So I think it would be monstrous to suggest that if there were no God, that my relationships with my husband, with my children, with my friends, with my colleague friends, that those would be meaningless. I mean, I don't understand the mindset that would think that would be the case. So I think that human life, particularly if you're lucky enough, as I said, to have material circumstances that allow you to find such relationships and to exercise your capacities and so forth, I think that the possibilities for meaning in human life are enormous, and you just don't have to go outside the natural order.
Dr. Ray?
Sometimes I've been tempted to the view that you call monstrous. I think if I was an atheist, I would not affirm the monstrous view. But I think, as I hear you talk, I find myself thinking, yeah, so what meaning do I think you can get on an atheistic worldview? And I guess I think it is just a different kind of meaning. And maybe I'll illustrate this way. A lot of people, when they look at, I'm like this actually, a lot of people when they look at, a lot of photos of just outer space, right? they get a sense of meaninglessness. I mean, I don't embrace it, but it's natural to have, I'm so small, right? But if you ask, like, what in the world does size have to do with meaning or value? Who knows? But it's just the thought that we're super valuable and we're super meaningful, it fits uneasily with the thought that we're just like another pebble on the beach, right? Fits uneasily. That's not to say that there's no meaning. That's not to say we can't, but it's harder to make sense of that. Within a theistic worldview, you get the maker of all things loves you a lot. And that it's sort of easy to see how that's a kind of meaning I can feel good about. And it's a kind of meaning a lot of people want. But I mean, that said, I think once you're in an atheistic worldview, I think you're exactly right to say, well, okay, I don't have that kind of meaning, and I'm not even looking for it. What meaning do I have? Do I really have to say I've got nothing? And then I think you're right. Yeah, you don't have to say you've got nothing, but it is something different, and it is something that some folks will judge to be not what they were looking for.
Can I be blunt?
Yeah.
So,
Can we stop you?
Probably not. So, I love my husband a lot, I love my kids a lot, I love my friends a lot. Are you saying that they're not important enough? That it has to be, this guy's the maker of the universe. He's really, really important. I don't think that makes his love more meaningful.
Yeah, I don't want to necessarily weigh it in terms of what's enough, right? It's qualitatively different.
Are you channeling Augustine here? Are you looking for something like his Confessions? Or?
It'd be nice if I was. I'm not meaning to. I mean, it's like this. There's a kind of significance, I think, that comes from being valued by the one who is, on my worldview anyways, the source of all value. And by being known and loved in the way that only an omniscient and perfectly loving being can know and love you.
Now it sounds like you're using love to mean love as we understand it. And I'm putting this together with your saying that we shouldn't have the expectation. So this is a love that's consistent with his putting your entire family in a concentration camp or giving you a fatal disease.
Yeah, in the short term. Just like the love of your husband is consistent with his doing all kinds of things that in the short term are like, you're not happy about it, right? Differences of degree here, right? But not in principle sorts of differences, I don't think.
Okay.
So our lines are getting longer. I see out of the corner of both eyes. We're due to move over here next, and apologies in advance if there's anyone that we don't get to in this public forum. So.
I'm taken with the concept of this being using a different lens. And I'm reminded that Galileo, when he saw the moons of Jupiter, and Leeuwenhoek, when he saw the animalcules, there was a major question about whether whether what they were seeing was a result of imperfections in the lens. Science at least offers the opportunity of grinding the lens in a different way or using a different kind of lens. What you got?
Theology.
I'm sorry?
Theology. Theology and biblical study. In the Christian tradition, it'll be biblical studies. If you're in a different religious tradition, maybe your religion has a different sacred text, or I don't know the different stories that'll be told by different religious views, but within Christianity, You've got this book that's supposed to, in some sense, be divine revelation, although, as one of my church history professors used to like to say, it is not a book written for children. It's a really hard book. But there's that and theology and I think exactly the same sort of theory-building enterprise that goes on in science and philosophy and the other theory-building disciplines. And we use that to, I like your way of putting it, we use that to grind the lens and to make it more, ideally more faithful.
But what we end up with, as the statistician G.E.P. Bach said, all models are wrong. But all models are wrong, but some are useful. So maybe your model is useful even if it's wrong, and ditto for you.
I think that is a view that the Christian tradition would, by and large, be pretty happy about.
Another topic we could spend a semester on. But instead, let's go over here.
So thank you guys for being here. I find this conversation fascinating. I will say up front that I do hear the voice of God. It is something I've heard, it's something I hear. I'm also a tree hugger. I'm also one that goes out in nature, and I know that I am connected to more than what my eyes can see. I love how, I forget who the philosopher is that talks about this morphic field that we all exist in and that we are all connected to one another. So I found it fascinating when you guys started talking about this idea of mind and asking myself the question, which I've asked over and over again, is mind something that we have, or are we in mind? It's in Acts, it says that it's in God that we live, move, and have our being. And sometimes I think that the problem with our theology and our religion is that we've misplaced this thing called God. We've given it some type of a different stint where we make it the guy up in the sky or the Michelangelo that we see rather than the energy that is in back of all life. So I'm wondering how we could be better served if we talked about it, and I don't want to say from a more elevated standpoint, but I guess I do. How can we redefine how we look at God so that it is not some idealized version of somebody being a puppeteer and pulling our strings? And I'd wonder how you guys might see things different if we change the conversation a bit and expanded on that perception. Because really everything does communicate. Everything does love. Everything does have an energy in back of it. So I just wonder if we could possibly talk about it in a different way.
The short answer on my side of things is, yeah, sure. I mean, there's a whole lot of different stories that people want to tell about God's relationship to the world, God's relationship to minds in the world, philosophical stories about where you'll find minds or mindedness in the world. You know, in a certain way, any of these sorts of views can be put on the table, right? There's all kinds of theological views about the way divine providence works. You know, is God more like pulling the strings on a bunch of puppets, or just letting things unfold, or something? But does God even know the future? Yeah, I mean, all of these are up for discussion in theology, and so I'm not going to try to, you know, lay out a whole bunch of different views. I think the main thing I want to say about this is how you conduct a discussion like that is going to depend on what kinds of constraints you want to recognize and what aspects of which tradition you want to be faithful to, right? So for my part, I try as much as I can to be constrained by what strike me as reasonable, plausible, informed interpretations of the Christian scriptures and the tradition. And that's going to rule out a bunch of different views. Other folks, there are fewer constraints, or there are political, ideological constraints, or or things like that. And so I think that's what the conversation kind of depends on. But yeah, the conversations can be had, and I think they're exciting ones.
Do you add anything to that?
No.
I might throw one other thing in there in my role with this center, and to point out part of the rationale for an event like this, or for having a humanities-driven curriculum, is precisely to push that kind of question, right? Not only to ask questions like, is the natural world all there is, but also to get ourselves thinking about how do we think about the question itself, right? And how do we become people who think more clearly and more deeply about those kinds of questions? So thank you very much for that. I believe we're over here next.
Can you hear me? It kind of infuriates me when somebody tells me that there's an all-loving God and we can't know his mind. Actually, should be her mind. If there is, there should be no sex anyway if you talk about God. Anyway, it infuriates me to hear people just so blithely say, we don't know what the plan is, and the suffering here doesn't really matter, because in the long run, I mean, I come from Germany, and I think this is just a bunch of shit when I think of Holocaust. Is there some kind of future plan when a baby dies of leukemia? What kind of plan is that? Why put the goddamn baby into the world? If you let it die of leukemia, what does it help? If God is all loving, then this shitty world and all the rest of it? No, I think exactly, and the idea that we can't have human values without the idea of God is ludicrous. I mean, if you're looking for justice, if you're looking for love, if you're looking for kindness, you don't need God. I don't need him, and I love, and I'm kind, and I look for justice. And in the Bible, in the Old Testament, slavery was accepted and all this kind of stuff. And I never got, when I was a kid, I was scared out of my mind because we had religion in school. And that was a public school. But I was scared to death that, that somebody would become some kind of salt column, or with Noah, with all this stuff just scared the hell out of me. And that's the idea that we are thinking about the future. God's plan is for the future. You have to behave yourself, otherwise you're not going to go to heaven. And heaven is heaven is what you really want. And if you don't, you go to purgatory and hell. The whole thing is, to me, it is actually immoral. That's all. And the idea that you come to God through feelings and because of, you have this feeling of wonder. When I saw the Grand Canyon, I was overwhelmed, but it had nothing to do with God. And to say that somebody who doesn't believe in God is not human or doesn't want to believe in God or is looking for God, I prefer science to God any day, unless science is making atom bombs that kill people. And I was in Dresden when it was being bombed, and I say, to hell with God.
So, insofar as there's a question, right? There's the problem of evil is a huge challenge to the sort of view, Dr. Ray, that you've been discussing. I'd be curious to know, Dr. Anthony, with respect to the last part of the comments there, if you see that kind of, the language you used just now was, I prefer science over God. And I'd be curious to know if you see that as the right way to draw the distinction. But I don't know if either of you want to speak to.
I'll comment briefly on it. If you heard me say that the suffering in this world doesn't matter, then I must have misspoken or been misheard, because I think it totally matters. I guess the main thing I want to say about sort of the content that was just said is, I mean, there's plenty of times when I feel similarly. I mean, I hang on to my Christian belief, right? But I think the sufferings in this world, many of them are terrible. You know, it infuriates you when people say, well, we just don't know the plan. I mean, it infuriates me to think that there's a God and to not know the plan. I mean, the fact is, I also think, though, that if I did know the plan, it wouldn't really help. I mean, I was scheduled to teach on the problem of evil at Notre Dame the day after a crane where someone was filming football practice had blown over in high wind, and the student up there filming was killed. And I was supposed to go in there and talk the next day to his peers about the problem of evil. And I'm like, you know, what can you say to this, right? And it struck me during that class that if God came down and gave me the answer to the question, why did this happen, I wouldn't feel any better. This happened so that this kind of complex good could be realized. That doesn't help, right? And that's one reason why this book on the hiddenness of God that I wrote has a chapter on lament and protest. I think within my theology, even God recognizes that folks coming at things from our perspective will look at the evil in the world and will rightly hate it. God hates it, but we will look at it and we will not see how this could be justly permitted, and we will be angry about that, and we'll be right to be angry about that. And I think there's a whole lot of evidence in the Old and New Testament that God authorizes just outright impious protest. And I think, so I don't know, and from my own theistic framework, I want to affirm a lot of that speech. Not the, you know, I love science rather than God bit, but a lot of it I want to affirm. And I think, in my view, God authorizes that.
So I've forgotten where the questioner went. I certainly have shared your outrage and your being infuriated about probably the same things that outrage and infuriate you. I don't know about preferring science to God. I don't think that's the choice. I think living in an immanent human way is the alternative to thinking about your life as being simply preparatory or instrumental to some other life. I also resonated with your saying that you were afraid when you were a child. I was terrified of things. I was raised as a Catholic, Roman Catholic, and I read a book about the Curé of Ars, that's how I pronounce it. This was a pious priest who became possessed by the devil. And the sort of moral of the biography that I was reading was that even the most exemplary person can just at the whim of God be inhabited by an evil spirit. And I just thought, who knows what's going to happen? The religion made the world a very, very scary place for me. I took this all very seriously. I guess, well, I'm going to say something I warned Mike that I was going to say. It does strike me that a hypothesis that we ought to consider, if we're considering supernatural hypotheses, is that there's an evil powerful, omniscient being that is just toying with us, that just set this all up for its own amusement. I mean, I think that if we're thinking in terms of what the evidence is, and I know Mike doesn't approach the question of the existence of God that way, but if we're really making a survey of the possibilities, it seems to me that it's much more likely that we are acting in a certain way like abused children or abused partners who struggle to put a loving face on a being that's monstrous. I don't know if that hypothesis is in the air. If I were to challenge Mike and say, how do you know that you're not being taken in by a manipulative, malicious being? We could find out. I could ask him. I mean, I think that if you're really considering supernatural hypotheses, that's one that has to be considered.
So a lot of issues now been raised. We're rapidly running out of time. Let's go to one last question. Again, apologies to those who are waiting and haven't had a chance to ask them. We'll get one last question here, and then there was one further issue, and we can do some quick closing comments, if that works.
Okay. Hi, this is a question for Dr. Ray. So I'm a chemist, and I kind of approach all my philosophy from a scientific standpoint. So in science, replicability is a really big...
your mouth at the mic.
Oh, sorry.
Is
this better?
Thank you. That's
okay.
better.
Replicability is a big issue in science. And like you were speaking about the sonogram technician who is able to look at a sonogram, an ultrasound, and assign a sex reliably and be able to do the same thing with different images. So is there evidence that that is possible with like divine experiences, that can be a replicably learned thing? And if not, how do you justify the existence of God if that's not something that can be repeated?
So I guess there are two separate questions there. One is, are the experiences of God replicable? I know there's been a lot of scientific research on them. I mean, there's been a lot of psychological and sociological research on these sorts of experiences, and there are hypotheses that make predictions, and they seem to be reasonably well confirmed. Things like you score high on the Tellegen absorption test, and you are more likely to be able to have some of these particular sorts of experiences that Tanya Luhrmann talks about in her book, like that sort of thing. The nature of the experiences, the nature of the experiments and the degree to which they're replicable, I don't know. As you probably know, psychology has been in the midst of a massive replication crisis for some time now. So who knows? But there's been research on it. But the second question was, if they're not replicable, how do you justify the existence of God? And the answer, I guess, is I never planned to justify belief in God on scientific research into religious experience, right? I'm sort of telling a story about how I think not in every case, but in a lot of cases, belief in God enters the picture and gets maintained, and rationally so. And that's a story according to which it's not an explanatory posit, but it's rather more like a lens through which we look at the world. But that story doesn't depend on any kind of replicable results in the social sciences or other sciences, and justified belief in God doesn't depend on the truth of exactly that story, I don't think, either. So.
All right, so one last question then for you two, and some excellent participation from the audience, so thank you all who spoke up. I wish we had half an hour on this one, but we've got maybe half a minute. one of the things that this center exists to do is to foster thoughtful discussion, right? And to be a place, and I will lay some of my cards on the table here. I am among those who think that the lack of civil discourse in America today is one of our most pressing problems, and one reason why I wanted to be in this job and why I pursued the kind of career I have is the belief that this kind of place, and the college classroom in particular, is maybe the last place in America where people who see the world very differently still get together and actually talk to each other, right? But there's a vexing philosophical problem lurking in the weeds here, where you two are what philosophers would call epistemic peers, right? You are both very intelligent, you're both very well informed, you've got access to more or less the same information, and yet you draw very different conclusions from it. And so what I'm curious about is can you coherently say, I think my interlocutor is a reasonable person, in spite of the totally wrong views that he or she holds, right? 30 seconds or less, what do you say?
You want me to go first? Or you want to go first?
I think Mike is very reasonable. I enjoy talking to him. I'd much rather talk to a reasonable person I disagree with than an unreasonable person I agree with. I mean, that doesn't get you anywhere. I think these are really, really complicated, subtle issues, and I've never bought there's this thing in epistemology, the study of knowledge, that if you have people that are equally intelligent, equally well informed, that somehow if they disagree with each other, there's some kind of problem about the rationality, reasonableness of the person. I just don't see any reason to believe that. I think it's just with issues this complicated and subtle, reasonable people are going to come to different conclusions, and it's great to be able to talk about them.
I think on that point we totally agree with each other. I mean, yeah, Louise is a very reasonable person. I have quite a few atheist and agnostic friends who I think are super smart, reasonable people. I mean, I think when we disagree, we're all committed to thinking that each of us is committed to thinking the other person is making some mistakes somewhere. Maybe we think we can identify those mistakes, and maybe we can't. Or maybe we think we can't, but thinking the other person has made some mistakes isn't the same as thinking they're unreasonable or, somehow beyond the pale of rational discourse or anything like that. I should say, too, it's not, I do think sometimes in these sorts of discussions, people attribute bad motives to one another. Like they think the other person isn't being sincere, or they think the other person is motivated by some kind of insidious selfishness or something like that. And I don't have any of those thoughts. You can have these discussions without having those thoughts too, I think.
What's great too, Mike made an argument I didn't anticipate. That's great. That's so interesting. And if you just have two people disagree with each other and are just going to, present their position, there isn't that kind of intellectual pleasure.
Well, it's a nice note to close on. We are about 5 minutes over. Could I ask each of you for the distilled essence of your closing thoughts? What is it that you'd like the audience, all of us, as we go forth from here tonight, what would you like people to be ruminating on over the next couple of days as they think about this? Dr. Antony?
Well, I guess I'll return to my theme of interconnection. If this is true, what else has to be true? I guess I didn't say very much about beliefs that you hold immune from revision. I mean, there are beliefs I have that it's very, very difficult for me to imagine, to even conceive of giving them up. I can't imagine what would rationally warrant my giving them up. A lot of them are beliefs about moral value, justice, things like that. There's nothing in a naturalistic picture that says you can't have beliefs like that, but being mindful of having beliefs that are very central, very core, very hard to give up, I think naturalism says, but you have to be open. You have to deal with the arguments that might come back at you. You have to at least, as I sometimes say, put a pin in it if somebody raises an objection to your view that you can't deal with. I think that's one of the most fascinating and valuable things that human beings are capable of doing is figuring stuff out. So I guess that's what I'd like to leave everybody with. Figure stuff out.
All right, and Dr. Ray.
I'll just recap what I think I tried to sketch an argument for, which is the view that if you think that everything that can be explained should be explained in ways that are sort of roughly continuous with scientific explanations, like the theory building activity ought to look sort of like the theory building activity that goes on in science. If you think that, you can still have rational belief in God. You can still find a place for experience of God. That kind of naturalism isn't really a threat, I don't think, to Christian belief. And if you take that to be your understanding of nature is all there is, then nature is all there is fully consistent with belief in God. God's just part of nature on that picture. But again, as I said, not nearly everybody who would say yes to is nature all there is would mean that. And I've struggled a lot to figure out what those other folks who say nature is all there is really mean, and to find a charitable meaning for it. And I can't really, or at least I can't find something that they could mean that also seems like it's reasonably well motivated and not incoherent.
And it'd be nice if we could hold views that were not incoherent.
Yeah.
Well, on that note, let me say thank you to everyone who's here tonight for joining us. I'll mention that there are some note cards out on a table up there. If you'd like to be notified of future events that we hold here at the center, just write your email address on one of those cards and drop it in the basket. Or if you have any other feedback or thoughts, put it on the card, and I promise we'll at least read it. I don't promise to do anything about it. But I'll read it, and I'll take it seriously. But thank you all for being here. Please join me one more time in thanking our esteemed guests tonight.